Hi everyone, welcome back to World Civilizations Online with myself and Dr. Haynes. As a reminder, since you haven't seen me for a few lectures, I'm Dr. Ross, and I will be with you for the next 4 lectures to talk about the rest of the Atlantic revolutions, specifically today the French Revolution, Thursday the Haitian Revolution, and then next week into the Industrial Revolution. We group these 3 revolutions, the American, the French, and the Haitian, as a kind of series of Atlantic revolutions that follow very similar themes that Dr. Haynes introduced last time, and that I'm going to explore through the next 2 examples as well. In particular, the tension between the rise of new ideals around liberty and equality in particular, and the kind of limitations of those ideals as they're put into practice. First in America, then in France, then in Haiti. And if you want an easy way of kind of remembering why we take them in this order, not as a hint, it's not simply for chronology. What we see is a gradual progression where these ideals become more fully put into practice as these revolutionary movements proceed. So the American Revolution, with its maintenance of slavery, its unwillingness to grant the vote and grant citizenship to women, and its limitation of the vote to the wealthy, represents a quote-unquote moderate revolution, if one could put those 2 terms together. I think my American historians, including Dr. Haynes, might disagree a bit. The French Revolution will grant the vote to everyone. Actually, excuse me, all men. Women do not do so well in any of these revolutions. And eventually, they will also grant freedom to enslaved peoples in the French colonies. Although that story I'm going to bracket for Haiti, which I argue is the ultimate culmination of the Haitian Revolution. That the Haitian Revolution, as the single most successful, in some respects, the only successful slave revolt in history, put into stark relief the limitations of these other revolutions by essentially saying, how dare you claim to be standing for liberty and equality and not including us just because of our skin color? And as you will see on Thursday, the Haitian revolutionaries will essentially take the languages of the American and French Revolution and throw them back at those who would continue to preserve the institution of slavery despite them. They will essentially throw into stark relief the hypocrisy of men such as Thomas Jefferson. So, throughout the Atlantic world, we see this movement towards liberty and equality, and often enough these discussions revolve around an essential political issue. Where does political authority properly lie? The question of liberty and equality, in other words, is not something, as Dr. Haynes pointed out last time, not something that remains in the texts and languages of idealists, but also had to be considered in light of specific political and institutional questions. Namely, how should societies best organize themselves in order to ensure the greatest liberty and equality for the people? And indeed, the people provide the key issue for all of these revolutions. Who constitutes the people? Does political power, sovereignty if you will, properly lie in the people? The French Revolution will specifically take up these issues as it argues against the principle of monarchy and in favor of that of democracy. And while at first the French revolutionaries will try to limit the ramifications of these ideals in very similar ways as the American revolutionaries, eventually they will come to realize that the granting of popular sovereignty cannot be easily restrained. And they will grant citizenship to all white men, and eventually all men. What the French revolutionaries do, in other words, is they invest political power with ordinary people in the name of a very radical solution, more radical than the world had yet seen, that of popular democracy. However, as we will see, people new to democracy don't always know what to do with it. And the kind of unfamiliarity of the French people with the possibility of democratic freedoms, of the willingness to listen to what the people want, created the conditions where extreme modes of violence could take place. And indeed, one could argue, and I will argue, that the fundamental problem with democracy, at least in the French case, was that the French did not know what to do with disagreement. And a democracy can only function insofar as you allow people to peacefully disagree. But if you take disagreement to mean you are an enemy of liberty, say, then the only possible outcome is yet more violence. So today I'm going to tell the story of the French Revolution. On Thursday, I will circle back and incorporate the Haitian Revolution into the story, and I will emphasize the ways in which the French revolutionaries attempted to reckon with their simultaneous desire for liberty and equality, and ultimately their fear of what those terms really mean when put into practice. So, to get started, we need a bit of context. What was France in the revolution revolting against in the late 18th century? Put simply, the French revolutionaries of the late 18th century were revolting against what historians, actually every person after 1789, after the French Revolution itself, called the old regime. The ancien régime in French, the old regime. The French Revolution claimed to create something new, the new regime. The old regime was characterized by a political system known as absolutism. Absolutism means simply what the word itself signifies. All political power is invested in the monarchy. The king of France in this case, or of Spain, or of Russia, depending on where you look, the ideology is the same, was absolute and could not be questioned. The king could not be subject to law because he was absolute. Absolutism invests power in the king that simply was not subject to any human law because it was, by definition, absolute. This power comes from God itself. And indeed, the kings of France and the kings of elsewhere claimed that their office was immortal, that they were not passing down a human institution, but rather a divine one. A divine one. The most famous of the absolute monarchs of France, not the one that the French revolutionaries will revolt against, the one who represents absolutism the best, is the King Louis XIV, pictured here in all of his imperial splendor. The absolute monarchs of Europe, including that of France, however, could not entirely, in practice, depend on their authority alone. Instead, absolute monarchs depended on a complex system of political hierarchy at the top of which they stood. In France, that hierarchy underneath the king was known as the estates system. French society was divided into three estates. The first estate, the clergy, about 100,000 people in France. The second estate, the nobility, 400,000 people in France, for a total of 500,000 people of the first two estates. And the third estate, everyone else. By everyone else, I mean everyone else. This includes extremely rich people and extremely poor people. It includes merchants, it includes lawyers, it includes beggars, it includes prostitutes, it includes everyone. Each estate had a certain legal position in French society. Absolutism as a system relied on a legal organization around specific rights and responsibilities depending on which group you belonged. So note the distinction between what I'm describing here and today. By what virtue do you have rights? By the fact that you are an individual American or other citizen. In America today, your rights are based on your existence as an individual. In France, your rights are based on which estate you belong to. The nobility, for instance, was exempt from taxation, and you'll see why that's important in a moment. The clergy, the first estate, had the right to levy their own tax, called the tithe, 10%. The third estate was often subject to the rights and privileges of these other estates. This is a system called privilege, that depending on which estate you belong to, you had a certain amount of privilege or lack of privilege. This strict social hierarchy provided the foundation under which the absolute monarch was able to maintain control of the entire country. Because it's by virtue of his will that these privileges continued to exist and perpetuate themselves. France, put simply, was a caste system. The estate into which one was born, the nobility is hereditary, the third estate is therefore hereditary as well, determined one's rights, responsibilities, and relative privilege in this society. Obviously, if you're interested, you can talk to me in office hours about all the nuances of that idea. So, very different than today. Today, we exist by virtue of our individuality. We are born, therefore we have certain inalienable rights and responsibilities. In France, that is not the case. You have rights and responsibilities determined by virtue of birth and provided for by the king. And it is that system that the French Revolution will destroy and tear down and put something new in its place. How did that happen? On what basis did the French revolutionaries form their ideas and understand what they were trying to accomplish? They were influenced by a movement that Dr. Haynes referenced last time, known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, as Dr. Haynes explained, had a great deal of influence on the American revolutionaries as well. You read last time John Locke. The Enlightenment, however, had an even greater influence, one could argue, in France, where it formed the basis of the critique that would eventually take down a monarchy that had existed for hundreds of years. Put simply, the Enlightenment was a broad social and intellectual movement that argued that human beings have the capacity to use their own reason to create social progress. To repeat in hopefully similar words, I'm not running off my notes for this definition. The Enlightenment was a social and intellectual movement that argued that human beings had the ability to use their capacity to reason to create social and political change. This is an outgrowth of the scientific revolution, which argued that human beings had the capacity to use their reason to discover natural and scientific truths that you can read about in your textbook, but we will not be covered in this class. So think about what this idea means, this 18th century movement that argues that human beings can create progress. Well, if you're living under a regime that says, actually, we exist in a social order that is based on an eternal truth given to us by God, the notion that human beings can actually change things for the better, according to them, is deeply troubling. The monarchs of France, relied on the notion of tradition and faith in the divine to support the continued existence not only of their own authority, but that of the estate system more broadly. Enlightenment thinkers said, well, that makes no sense. Actually, I think, and because I'm a human being, and because I have the capacity to reason, and I have rational thoughts, I can look at this system, figure out what's good, what's bad about it, and think of something better that could replace it. I don't have to rely on tradition. I don't have to rely on received wisdom. I don't have to rely on God. Because in fact, human beings constitute all the knowledge and all the wisdom we need to formulate something better. And you can see this in this image. This is the frontispiece of the encyclopedia, the Encyclopédie, which was the biggest project of the Enlightenment that tried to contain within its volumes the entirety of human knowledge. The entirety of human knowledge. And note the way the image portrays this quest to contain all of human knowledge as itself divine. That the light of God shines down on this effort to put into books what can be discovered by humans. We don't need the monarch, we don't need God. The implication is, we ourselves as human beings are divine by our very nature. These are radical ideas. These are deeply troubling ideas that would, in the end, shake the foundations of the very structures that gave them birth in the first place. Now, there are many Enlightenment thinkers. You read Locke. You might have heard of Montesquieu in your high school civics class, who came up with the notion of the separation of powers. Some of you might have also heard of my two of my favorites. I almost just said one. Two of my favorites, Diderot and Voltaire, two very funny and witty Enlightenment thinkers. But I just want to make sure I mention one specific Enlightenment thinker, also French, and perhaps also came up in your high school civics class, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was not a typical Enlightenment thinker. He didn't only think that we could come to human truth on the basis of reason. He also emphasized emotion, for instance. He thought all the other Enlightenment thinkers hated him. They kind of did. He thought that he was constantly being laughed at. But despite his kind of status as an outsider, he laid down the ideas that would form the crux of the French Revolutionary, and in some ways the American critique of monarchy itself. Most Enlightenment thinkers, despite their emphasis on progress, did not argue for the destruction of all existing systems of government, right? They were fundamentally conservative with a small c and interested in stability as much as they were in human progress. Not so Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau argued that, Rousseau argued that the only legitimate source of sovereignty, the only legitimate source of political power, and that's all that sovereignty really means, political power, resides in the people themselves. He argued in his most famous book, The Social Contract, that in fact the king's claim to sovereignty was illegitimate. Because the king can never take away the fundamental power of the people themselves. He can just pretend to have taken away the ability of the people themselves. He argued instead that the people needed to come together and form what he called the general will to govern society. In other words, he argued for democracy, but very simply. You know, if you ask your political philosopher professors, they will tell you all about how that's not quite what he was saying, but it'll serve for today. Rousseau argued, put simply, that the king was not legitimate and that only the people were. That only the people were. And it's that notion of the general will that constitutes the only legitimate source of political sovereignty, of political power, that will form the basis for the democratizing trends of France during the 18th century. It is very difficult to underestimate the power of Rousseau's ideas. If you're curious, he did not only influence democratic ideas, but also those of socialism, communism, and fascism going forward into the 20th century. Something you can learn about in a more advanced history course. Okay, so that's the intellectual basis for the critique that the French Revolution would levy against the monarchy and would eventually kind of sort of be put into practice as the 18th century wore on. It was not, however, the initial spark of the French Revolution itself. And that's something always to keep in mind, that there's the ideas, and again, this alludes back to Dr. Haynes' lecture about the American Revolution. There are the ideas that animate these revolutionaries, and then there's the kind of conditions that actually make space for and create the possibilities for actual revolution. Just like in the American Revolution, the spark, the cause, the immediate justification for the French Revolution is ultimately about finances. Right? No taxation without representation in America, and while they didn't use the phrase in France, it's essentially the same thing. Essentially the same thing. So, the French Revolution begins with a financial crisis. The monarchy, which, by the way, helped ensure the success of the American Revolution, was deeply in debt by the 1770s and into the 1780s, in large respect due to that very intervention. That France's desire to kind of take Britain down a peg ultimately leads to the destruction of the French monarchy entirely. So you can see this from this chart. It's in French up here, but you can see the translation down here. What I would like to focus your attention to is right here, servicing the debt. 30% of the royal budget in 1774 was going to servicing the debt. And this comes up in American politics quite a bit. When you are spending most of your money just paying off interest that is accumulating on your debt, what happens? Creditors begin to think you're not actually that safe with investment, and they will stop lending to you. Interest rates will rise, and eventually the problem simply compounds itself. By the 1780s, the French monarchy was not spending 30% of its budget paying off the debt, but rather 50% to pay off the debt. Excuse me, 50% of its national budget to pay off the debt. So, a couple things a king can do in order to solve this problem. They could default. I mean, they're a king. They could just say, forget it. We're not going to pay off the debt. The kings of Europe, not just France, have tried that before, and sometimes it works for a time, not long term, because if you default on your debts, people won't loan to you later. The other option, the better option, one could argue, I think I would, is to find new sources of revenue. Right? Get more money into the royal coffers so you can pay off the debt. What is the most likely source of revenue for a government? Taxes. Taxes, increased taxes, would provide a way for the king to pay off its military debts. However, who should we tax in order to pay off these debts? Well, we have these three estates, the first, second, and third. I can actually go back. So think about these three states. We have these three groups. Remember, your prerogatives, your rights and responsibilities are dependent on the state. Okay, well, we have the clergy that is essentially exempt from taxation, and in fact is so exempt that it can levy its own taxes. You have the nobility, which is also exempt from taxation. So that leaves us with the third estate. The third estate would be the place we could go to get some more money. The third estate, however, was essentially already taxed to death. There was very little more you could get out of them. I mean, that's, you could complicate that a bit. I mean, the vast majority of the poor within the third estate certainly had no more money to give. The rich merchants kind of did, but they weren't too happy about being asked to do so again since they're, doing work, unlike the nobility. So the king decides to approach the nobility in particular and say, I'm not sure I can really squeeze the third estate much more than I already have. I would really appreciate it, nobility, if you would let me raise taxes on you. It's the only way we're going to solve this problem. It would be really kind of good of you to let me do so. Now you can think about this. This is supposedly an absolute monarch. He supposedly can do whatever he wants, but he doesn't feel that he has the power to simply say, okay, nobility, your privilege is over, I am raising taxes on you. He fears the nobility. So instead he asks their permission. And the nobility say something interesting. They say, well, actually, we can't do that. We can't, excuse me. He does, sorry, I skipped a step. He asked the nobility for permission to raise new taxes at an assembly of notables, which meets in 1787. So this is where he does that. And in some ways it's the start of the French Revolution, although I think I'd argue it's the next step that really does it. So excuse me. So just to repeat, to clarify, the king approaches the nobility to ask for new taxes at the assembly of notables. The nobles, sensing that they have leverage, suddenly the king needs something, decide to make an interesting demand. They essentially say, well, actually no taxation without representation. They say, well, we don't have the authority to agree to new taxes because the legislative body that can do so is not the Assembly of Notables, it's a thing called the Estates General. It's a thing called the Estates General. The Estates General is simply another word for Parliament. It's the French Parliament. It's the French House of Representatives. It's the legislative body. So the nobility, asked to give more taxes, says, well, actually, unless we can constitute ourselves as a representative body, we can't agree to that. It's exactly the demand of the elites of the American Revolution. We can only agree to taxes if we are represented. And the place to be represented in France is the Estates General. And the king says, okay, I will call the Estates General, I will call this Parliament to agree to new taxes. That's a big deal. The Estates General, this is 1789, excuse me. The Estates General had not been called in France since 1650. 160 or so years between callings of the French Estates General. That means that what the king has done is give a great deal of power back to those representatives who will be in this meeting. And so it raises up a whole set of possibilities for those who are being called. The Estates General was kind of democratically elected. Various constituencies back in French towns and cities elected representatives to go and give their requests and demands to the king that far exceeded the question of taxation, because people saw an opportunity here. The elections for the Estates General was the last time in France until 1945 that women will vote in France. Not many women, but a few. had the right to vote for the Estates General, and they will not have that right again. Why did they do so? In order to make demands upon the king. So, one other problem that arises when you are calling a legislative assembly, essentially, after 160 years of it laying dormant, is that people don't really know how this thing works. And in fact, in 160 years, a lot of things have changed over time. The Estates General, when it was last called in 1615, it might be 1614 actually, excuse me. Last time it was called, was organized by estate. That's why it's the Estates General. And the way it'd be organized was this: you would elect your representatives in each estate, and each estate had one vote. The first estate had one vote, the second estate had one vote, and the third estate had one vote. That seems to... I don't know, if I'm a member of the third estate and I'm looking at that, I'm going to think I'm going to have a problem. I'm going to have a problem because I am the third estate, I don't have much privilege, but the first and second estates have a lot of privilege, and they're probably going to try and protect it, so they'll probably just vote together. And I'm going to get outvoted all the time. So know what I just did in my story. I just changed the actor of the French Revolution. The calling of the Estates General was due to the nobility. But once the Estates General is called, the people who see a new opportunity is the third estate, everyone else. It's the nobility that see an opportunity in the calling of the Estates General. But once called, once you have voting, once you have democracy, at least a little bit of it, it's the third estate that take the opportunity. Take an opportunity. And the third estate argues, it's not fair for us to meet by estate. We constitute 22 million of the 22.5 million people. You represent 500,000. We are the merchants, we are the builders, we are the people who do stuff. You are the parasites. You are the people who don't do anything. We should have as much say in what the Estates General decides as anyone else. And the person who made this claim most forcefully is one of your readings, the Abbé de Sieyès. A clergyman, no, so a member of the First Estate, but nonetheless got elected as a member of the Third Estate. And the Abbé de Sieyès published a pamphlet as the Estates General was being organized, where he asked a very simple question. What is the Third Estate? And he has some answers. What is the third estate? It is everything. What has it been before this moment? Nothing. What will it do now that it has the opportunity to become something? The calling of the Estates General, put simply, provides a political opportunity for the formerly excluded masses of French people to have a political voice. And they decide to take that voice up. Now, within these debates lies a very dangerous germ, a dangerous kernel. And it's in your text. I put up the quote. This is going to be small. You should go to your text and look at this quote. Right? It's a lot of text. Who then would dare to say that the third estate has not within itself all that is necessary to constitute a complete nation? The implications of this argument is not simply that the third estate should be a part of this new body, but rather is the only part that matters. That is the only part that matters. And in fact, the other orders, the privileged orders, the first and second estates, are a problem. If the privileged order were abolished, the nation would not be something less, but something more. Get rid of the nobility, and you do not harm the nation. You do not harm France, you make it better. It's a short step from arguing that we should abolish the nobility to arguing that we should eliminate the nobility. Not simply as an estate, but as individuals, essentially. So what's happening within these debates over how the Estates General is going to form itself is kind of a very radical idea that it is not the first and second estates that form the political power base of France. It's rather everyone else. It's everyone else. In any case, people have to make a decision. How are we going to organize the Estates General? The Third Estate has an idea. Let's double the amount of people in the Third Estate at the Estates General, and we will vote individually. So we will have as many people as the other two combined, and at least we'll even the stakes a little bit. And maybe we can pick off some individual nobles and clergymen, and we could at least win some concessions. The king, faced actually with the nobility being like, whoa, we're not so sure about this, says, I have a great idea. I have a compromise. I will double the size of the Third Estate, so you'll have twice as many people as each, you'll have as many people as the other two put them together, but you're still going to have to vote by estate. That doesn't solve any problem. The Third Estate will still get outvoted. It doesn't matter how many people you have if you're still voting by estate. And so, the Third Estate decides to make a radical move. The Third Estate decides that unless the king agrees to allow them to vote individually, vote by head is the way it was called, they will not agree to any business whatsoever at the Estates General. They are going to use their leverage to gain power no matter what. When they make this demand of the king says, I don't care what you want, I'm the king. And he in fact locks the Third Estate out of their meeting room at the Estates General and attempts essentially to disband them. The representatives of the Third Estate, in response, retreat to the largest space that could fit them all, the Royal Tennis Court, this is Versailles, and swear an oath that they will not disband until they had drafted a constitution. They declared themselves the National Assembly and argued that political power resides not in the king, but in the people. I said before that one could say that the French Revolution begins with the Assembly of Notables. The reason I said one could say is that I would argue that the French Revolution begins now with the Tennis Court Oath. And the reason it begins with the Tennis Court Oath is that the Tennis Court Oath represents the Third Estate asserting that sovereignty resides with itself as a whole, as the nation. That they represent France. They are France. Not the king, but the Third Estate itself. They have, in other words, usurped. They have taken away political power from the king and said, no, we hold political power. And we are going to write a constitution to exhibit that political power, to lay out what that political power means. Now, again, the king not quite thrilled with this, not quite happy with this idea that, oh, suddenly these I mean, they weren't peasants in the Tennis Court Oath, but let's use peasants as a metaphor. These peasants are going to tell me what to do? I think not. I think absolutely not. And he tries to disband the Tennis Court Oath, or excuse me, the National Assembly. He calls in the troops. They're surrounding him, and the revolution is saved. But it is not necessarily saved by those who want a constitutional monarchy, by people who are kind of invested in kind of wheeling and dealing of the representatives of the Third Estate. It's saved instead by the people of Paris. On July 14th, 1789, the people of Paris rise up against the king in order to save the revolution, to prevent him from disbanding the National Assembly. They rise up and attack a symbol of royal authority known as the Bastille, a prison that also is known to hold arms. They kill the guards. They put them on pikes and they walk them around Paris. And the king is forced to back off. So, the story gets complicated at this moment. We begin the story of the French Revolution with the nobility versus the king. Then we move to the third estate against the nobility and the king. And now we're moving into a phase where it's kind of the third estate, the representatives of the third estate, and ordinary people. Think back to your American Revolution lecture. The people running the revolution are elites. They're representatives, they're politicians. In France, most of the people elected to the Estates General and then the National Assembly were lawyers. They don't necessarily represent the interests of the people. They represent their own interests. They might speak in the name of the Third Estate, but what they really mean is that we speak in the name of the elites of the Third Estate. The people of Paris have other ideas. The people of Paris say the revolution is about us as well. And it's from the people, the ordinary people, rising up to defend the revolution that it has the potential to take a much more radical turn. To argue not simply for a constitution under which the king might still exist, but perhaps for democracy, put simply. Now, it's important to recognize that this wasn't simply the people of Paris doing this, it wasn't simply men doing this. We're all probably familiar with the recent Women's March to Washington. The first Women's March was in France in 1789, when, in order to defend the French Revolution shortly after Bastille Day, July 14th, the women of Paris, the poor women of Paris, I mean that financially, not metaphorically, go to Versailles, where the king lived, to bring him back to Paris, to force the king to accede to the demands of the revolution. And they do. They go to Paris, they they wait outside Versailles, and they grab the king, Marie Antoinette, his wife, and they bring him back to Paris. In fact, the French Revolution represents at first a liberation of women's political energies. It unfortunately will not have a long-term effect in France for women, but that's another story. Once the king and queen are brought back by these women, the revolutionaries actually begin to set out their first constitution. And so their goal, right, the tennis court oath, we will not disband until we have formed a constitution. The work has to begin. We have to actually write that constitution. That's hard. Writing a constitution is difficult. It took Americans 2 tries to get it right. So the revolutionaries instead say, let's at least lay down some ideals that the Constitution should follow. And they put down your other reading for today, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, that will lay out the fundamental rights of all French citizens. So no longer will your rights be defined by your estate, but rather by your existence as a French citizen, as an individual. So that transition is happening in France on the basis of this discussion over constitutionalism. Note this image of the Declaration of Rights of Man. Think about that encyclopedia, a title page. It's the Ten Commandments. They are taking up the divine and putting it into the social, putting it into human words. Now, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen is an interesting document for a lot of reasons. It represents, in microcosm, a lot of the tensions that will kind of, tear apart the French Revolution more broadly. On the one hand, it represents the attempt of the French revolutionaries to ensure that each individual French citizen, by virtue of their Frenchness, have certain inalienable rights, to use American terminology. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, whatever. On the other hand, they were also deeply concerned for social stability. It gets back again. Note the theme, expect an essay question, the divide between ideals and practicalities. So I want to point to a couple terms. I might move past the next slide, we'll see. The very first term of your document, of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. Okay, 2 things happening. All men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Okay, that's great, equality, liberty, we're good. But the very next sentence says, well, but social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. That's a tension. Equality versus distinction. The French revolutionaries want to have it both ways. They want to say, we are all equal, but they recognize that sometimes society needs to recognize inequality. And they will do so in a lot of ways. The first French Constitution will not grant the vote to all male citizens. The French Revolution will never grant the vote to women, which led to your final document, a response by Olympe de Gouges, a woman activist during the French Revolution, who pointed out the hypocrisy and created her own document to respond to the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. In fact, she says, woman, is born free and lives equal to man in her rights as well. Social distinctions can be based only on the common utility. Note the slight shift in language. De Gouges was pointing out, you revolutionaries might claim to be for equality, but in fact you're all hypocrites. Because you don't recognize the equality of woman to man. That's not to say that de Gouges didn't recognize as well the ways in which women's interests were different from men's interests. Take what she does to number 11 of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Free speech. The free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious rights of man. The right to free speech. That's all that means. De Gouges, however, says, the free communication of thoughts and opinions is one of the most precious rights of woman because that liberty, since that liberty assures the recognition of children by their fathers. De Gouges recognizes, just like the French revolutionaries, that it is not so simple to say we all have free speech. Rather, she needs to recognize that we all have free speech and the need for it for very specific reasons. That women may be equal to men, but they require these rights because they're women, not simply because they're individuals. Again, that tension between equality, full equality, liberty, and the actual put into practice of these ideals. De Gouges will be executed for her efforts, for the record. So, as I said, the initial constitution of the French Revolution, enunciated in 1791, we will not ask you for that particular date. 1789 is more important. The Constitution of 1791 was not one that elaborated a republican form of government. It was not one that gave full equality even to men. It took to 1792, 1793 for that promise to be fulfilled. In the course of the revolution, and we're not going anywhere into the details, the French Revolution and the revolutionaries get involved in a series of wars. The wars do not go well. And in response, a series of popular revolts take place in the early 1790s that overthrows, essentially, the initial moderate revolutionaries of the Tennis Court Oath and the National Assembly. And in its place, a republic is declared. The French Revolution, the French First Republic. France is on Republic number 5 at the moment. The French First Republic. The French First Republic was a much more radical experiment than the initial efforts of the revolutionaries that lasted between 1789 and 1792. It is where we see the ways in which the French Revolution exceeded the moderation of the Americans, but would still not quite get to where Haiti will be on Thursday. So let me conclude with a few words on the French First Republic. The French First Republic was founded on the basis of universal manhood suffrage. What that means is that every man in France had the right to vote. At the time, France was the only country in, probably in the world, I'll hedge a little bit, that one could say that for. That all men had the right to vote. However, the French First Republic was also unique for the conviction of its own, the justice of its cause. France, remember, had no experience with democracy. And France was currently under attack from enemies both within and without. And in a time where a nation feels very insecure, it often doesn't do well at tolerating dissent. So the irony of the French First Republic is that on the one hand, it represents a more complete fulfillment of the ideals of the French Revolution. On the other hand, it represents their ultimate failure. And one thing you could think about is the ways in which the failure of this First Republic continues to have lessons today. So, when the Republic is promulgated, when the Republic is announced, a man essentially emerges as the de facto leader of the French First Republic, Maximilien Robespierre. He's the head of what was known as the Committee of Public Safety. Again, you don't know the details. For our purposes, he was in charge of the French First Republic. A democracy, supposedly. Robespierre, however, had a great deal of suspicion of those who disagreed with him. Robespierre believed that the only way to secure the Republic itself was to ensure that the enemies of liberty, as he called them, could not threaten it. Now think about this, and I don't want to belabor the point, but it's an important one. When you disagree in the Senate, the US Senate, someone disagrees with you, you don't immediately say, you're an enemy of America. At least we shouldn't. At least you shouldn't. You say, that is your right. Whether I am a Republican or you are a Democrat or whatever, that is your right to disagree. And we will debate those disagreements and we will vote. It's the notion of the loyal opposition, that even if you don't have power, you have the right to speak your piece. In this new democracy, Robespierre didn't see things that way. If I said, I disagree with you, Robespierre, he would say, that means you're an enemy of liberty. That means you're a threat. That we are too fragile to allow for that kind of debate. That Robespierre believed that the only way to secure the stability and virtue of the French First Republic was not to provide the space for debate, the space for dissent, but to eliminate its possibility in the first place. And that's why we need to remain, the faith that democracy can survive disagreement is the thing that holds it together. And Robespierre didn't have that faith. So even though this French experiment was more democratic than the American, it was more radical than the American, it did give more people more rights than the American, it failed because it ultimately didn't have enough faith in its own beliefs. Robespierre will launch what is known as the Terror. And we mean that literally. He used terrorism to enforce consent within France. He used violence, not debate, not conviction, in a democracy to ensure the support of the people. He instead used violence. The Terror begins with the execution of the king himself, King Louis XVI, executed in early 1793 by what was then called the National Convention, but essentially by Robespierre himself. So this is a lithograph of that moment. But that was only the beginning. Through the course of 1793 especially, but into 1794, Robespierre and his allies will murder thousands and imprison tens of thousands of people on mere suspicion of doubting the French Republic. In Britain, in Great Britain, it's worth pointing to this image, this was seen with horror. The death and destruction that the French revolutionaries portrayed was seen with horror. And this is a British cartoon showing the British view of what is happening in France. This is the guillotine, which is how they executed the victims of the Terror. The guillotine was seen as a more scientific, a more humane form of execution. The idea is that you put the head between the posts, you let the blade fall, and the only thing the victim feels is a whisper on their neck. The British didn't quite see it that way. Note the scatological imagery, right, that the revolution essentially is sick, that he is shedding the blood of the victims of the terror, that fundamentally this democratic promise is ill, it is sick. And there's something to be said for that claim. Again, thousands murdered, because Robespierre didn't have enough faith in the power of democracy. Eventually that will come to bite Robespierre himself. By 1795, Robespierre had essentially killed everyone who he could, and he began to turn on his own allies. And they instead decide, actually, we've had enough of this. We now feel kind of threatened. So your turn. Robespierre actually, before he himself was put to the guillotine, tried to kill himself. So for all the death and destruction that he laid to the people of France, he wouldn't face the same consequences. 1794, I misspoke. He himself will be executed under the guillotine. In total, 40,000 people will be officially executed during the terror. 300,000 will be imprisoned. And during a civil war that will rage between the Republic and largely Catholic areas of northwestern France, which I obviously did not cover and you're not responsible for, but worth pointing out, 250,000 people will die. These are massive numbers for the 18th century. So I conclude by essentially repeating my lesson. The French Revolution begins with an attempt to take power from the monarchy and give it to the people. But it ultimately fails to have enough faith in the people themselves for, and the people's responsibility to hold on to it. And so the French Revolution ultimately is an object lesson in the fundamental weakness of democracy itself. You have to have faith in it for it to survive. Or else you'll quickly realize just how tenuous our own system is. Next time, we loop back to the same period to talk about the Haitian Revolution and the way that Haitians took up these ideals and put them even into greater practice than the French. We'll see you then.